Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Queen's Gallery. It's really fantastic to see you all here this evening. My name is Hannah Lake. I'm Head of Learning at Royal Collection Trust. The Singh Twins are internationally renowned contemporary British artists, cited by Sir Simon Sharma as representing the artistic face of Britain. Their award-winning art engages with social, cultural, and political dialogues and challenges Eurocentric perceptions of art, heritage, and identity. Formal recognition of their work includes an MBE in 2011 and honorary doctorate from the University of Chester in 2015 for outstanding contribution to British art. Their recent exhibition, Slaves of Fashion, at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, explores how global narratives around trade, colonialism, conflict, and slavery, connected to India's historical textile industry, remain relevant to current debates on the legacies of empire and ethical trade and consumerism today. We're more than delighted to have them with us this evening, and indeed that they agreed to create Rule Britannia, and that work responds to both the exhibitions which form part of Splendours of the Subcontinent here at the Queen's Gallery. I'd also like to introduce my Royal Collection Trust colleague, Emily Hannam, with whom the Singh Twins will be in conversation. Emily is curator of this exhibition, 4 Centuries of South Asian Paintings and Manuscripts, and specialises in Islamic and South Asian works of art. She spent the last 3 years researching the Indian paintings and manuscripts in the Royal Library at Windsor for this exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to all for coming and joining us this evening. My co-curator, Kajal, and I were so delighted when the Singh Twins agreed to work with us on this new commission. And it has been such a pleasure working with you on this project, and it's a great pleasure having you here this evening.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start off by asking you to introduce us to this new work that you've created for us.
Well, the work is a mixed media piece. It's quite a digression from the work that we're generally known for, which is rooted in the Indian miniature tradition of exquisite, sort of highly technical, hand-painted work. This particular piece combines that hand production with digital technologies and also combining reworked archival material. And partly it includes some of those archival objects because this artwork was partly in a response to the collections here, particularly the ones on display.
Yeah. How did you approach the commission? Because we asked you to create new work that responded to both parts of the exhibition, but also that addressed the challenges that are inherent in putting on an exhibition of South Asian works of art from the collection of the British royal family. So how did you go about, where did you start when we asked you to do this?
Well, the starting point, as with a lot of our work, was looking at the source material, in this case, the collections themselves. And I have to say that with the work that we do, very often we do interpret historical objects and try and make them relevant for today and also find the hidden meanings and the diverse meanings behind those objects. So it was a delight for us to be able to, first of all, work with those collections in the Royal Collections exhibition here. And I guess we were just looking at them with an artistic eye. What did they represent to us as British Asians for a start, but also as artists and the kind of narratives that we could draw out from those objects, some of which are actually represented in the artwork, as I mentioned
Let's
earlier.
look at the triptych. Can you talk to us about?
Well, as the title suggests, it's about Britain's maritime connections with India and the legacies of that, and one important legacy, of course, being cultural exchange and the material culture that we see around us today, going back to the collections, of course.
This is a very complex history.
It is a very complex history, and the triptych is really designed as a timeline of that history. So you have a panel on the left, which is looking at the early encounters of the British with India, particularly from the time of Queen Elizabeth I. So her granting of the charter to the East India Company, which were the key traders of that time, direct trade between Britain and India through the sea as opposed to overland and the traditional silk routes. So the image is all about that connection with the sea, the maritime connection, and how that was really a facilitator for the British Empire. Initially, the sort of control of India and the resources through trade, and then eventually the transfer of that power to the British crown. So with the timeline here, as I say, you start with Queen Elizabeth I, and there are various symbols around that initial imagery which look at those early days of trade and the kinds of commodities that were desired by the West at that time. So they have the spice tree there, for example.
Yes, can you tell us about that spice tree? What is the symbolism of that?
Well, it represents the wealth of India, and spices was something which were highly valued at that time. And initially they were commodities that were exchanged for Indian textiles. India really didn't need anything else from the West at that time.
So you have that represented in the image itself. Yeah. So you have the spice tree in the centre at the base of the first panel. And to the left you have the figure of the Indian woman who's actually inspired by one of the figures from one of the miniatures on display.
She's my cover girl for the book.
So,
I was so delighted when you had her.
Well, it was such a beautiful image. We had to use it in this piece. And she's representing that textile trade in itself. She's wearing the muslins and the chintzes and the calicos and the brocades.
But you've changed this. What's she holding?
She's actually holding a sprig of indigo. So that was one of the other commodities that were traded, particularly during the East India Company, who eventually gained a monopoly on the trade of indigo, which was one of the most ancient dyes to come out of India and also one of the most sought-after dyes once the West had discovered.
And what about the figure on the right?
Well, the figure on the right is Britannia treading upon the Bengal tiger, and that representation, it really refers to the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and it's really representing that transition period really between the East India Company as masters of India, if you like, rulers of India, and how that really was a turning point to the transfer of power being taken from the East India Company to the British Raj. So that takes us over to the third panel, in fact, on the right-hand side, where the focus is Queen Victoria at the top here.
So it's almost like a mirror image.
That's right, yes. So, and you've got the different dates. You've got 1858 to 1947. So it's that period of the British Raj, which is the next stage, if you like, of Britain's relationship with India through trade. And at the bottom of that particular panel, we have a different kind of tree, more representing the kind of commodities that then Britain took control of, the cotton, the tobacco. It was really commodities that the initial trade with textiles really financed.
But also the setting up of the plantations. So
Yes.
this is a colonial era of setting up plantations in India, as opposed to just trading with India. This is where we have the acquisition of lands as well as resources and the expansion of the empire in India
And
as
the
well.
exploitation of...
And the exploitation of India, of course. And then there are other symbols within that panel. At the bottom, for example, we have the boat, which is named after the Maharaja Dalip Singh being the Maharaja of Punjab, which was the last area to be annexed to the British Empire during the...
Tell us more about this boat, because I wasn't aware of it before I saw your work.
Well, this is a boat that was, a ship I should say, that was actually built in Liverpool, our home city, so it was fascinating for us to find that personal connection.
Absolutely.
Named after Maharaja Dalip Singh. And we discovered this by reading some contemporary news journals of the time, which was about the launch of the ship in Liverpool. And it was really talking about how this was a ship that was a first of its kind in many ways. It was an iron-built steamship, so it really represented that period of the Industrial Revolution, which is why it's represented in this section of the image, because, of course, the Industrial Revolution had a huge impact on the ability of Britain to further its acquisitions in India and also take over such important industries such as the textile trade.
It had such a negative effect on India, such a positive impact on the British
right.
economy, but at the same time decimating the Indian textile trade.
That's right.
And so, but again, the closer you look, the more you discover. So tell us more about what's on the ship.
I'll try and...
Also on the ship, we have on the sails, well, you have the coat of arms of Maharaja Dalip Singh on the sail bottom left, the largest sail at the bottom left, and that's because we wanted the ship to also represent migration, because we're looking at the symbolism of the sea and sea vessels. And I guess we should go back to the beginning of the commission when you were asking about how this came about and how we approached it. And one of the ways we did this was to home in on one particular object in the collections, which was one of the it was sort of advertised as one of the star items,
it is one of ours,
which is the peacock boat, which actually appears in the centre panel of this artwork. But we took that object and we wanted to interpret it from many different ways. And for us, a key starting point was, what does a boat symbolise? It symbolises maritime exploration, cultural exchange, conquest, trade even, but also the fabric that the boat is made of, this beautiful, rich commodities of gold and precious stones, which symbolized for us that sort of the Western view of the wealth of India, the sort of the magnificence and wealth of India at that time, and all through the history of that relationship with Britain and India. India is seen as this place that was, basically the jewel in the British crown is what it became because of that wealth and those commodities that Britain could have access to.
But being placed in that particular panel in the centre, which actually represents the legacies, if you like, of the British presence in India, it's really this idea of bringing literally people, culture, ideas from India to Britain. And of course, it was a two-way process, actually. There were influences going both ways. But particularly, obviously, India had a big impact in terms of the cultural legacies. Indian design, for example, was hailed as something that was to be aspired to by people like William Morris and, the kind of, Edinburgh and Jones and the like. So this is represented within the centre panel. You have these little details of pattern along the bridge there, which is from William Morris and De Morgan, and also the Grammar of Ornament by Owen Jones, which was a handbook, if you like, that was used within schools of design here to show good practice. It was all examples of Indian
Well, exactly. It was
design.
At this time, post-industrial revolution, when British craftsmanship had just, the industrial revolution meant that there was no
That's right,
indigenous
the decline
craftsmanship.
in
And so
handcraft.
Indian craftsmanship was heralded as the best example of its type in terms of manufacture.
Exactly,
by
yes.
hand.
So that's just one of the many things that, if you like, has come from this relationship. And, the backdrop there is a cityscape representing the multicultural Britain, so from London all the way up to Scotland, where Asian communities have settled. The idea of migration itself is obviously a legacy of the British presence in India. We ourselves are a product of that, being born and brought up here.
So I want to go back now and ask you about the very beginning, about you starting out. How did you become artists?
By accident. We never really intended to take up a career in art. I mean, we've always been interested in artistic things, painting, drawing, since the age of dot. And that wasn't really our vocation, though.
Yeah, I saw it mostly as a hobby alongside the heavy-going subjects, the sciences, which is what we started on the road to becoming, we wanted to become doctors, and that was our goal in life, but our teachers thought otherwise. I think they were quite keen that we should be going down the route of art, although we did fight against that quite a lot.
Oh, so you did have people who were really supporting you from the very beginning?
Within the arts, you mean?
Yeah.
They were kind of supporting us against our will, if I could put it that way. So it was an unwelcome support at that time, because our vision of what we wanted to do was not be artists, as I mentioned. We wanted to be doctors. And I think there was that stereotype view of all Asian children being forced into various professions, which, happens in any society, I think. It wasn't just something to do with Asians. But anyway, it kind of went against us at that time, because we were channeled into the arts because of the lack of support that we had for our chosen vocation, which was medicine. It's a very long story, but to cut it short, we ended up not doing medicine, but enrolling on a combined studies degree course at university. And ironically, we had to pick 3 subjects, and the only other subject that fitted in with the other 2 subjects, which we really were fascinated by, that was
Which were?
Ecclesiastical history and comparative religion. Art was the only other thing that fitted with the timetable, so we were sort of forced into being, sitting there doing 20th century Western art.
And then when did that take over?
Well, it took over more as a sort of a challenge to the kind of attitudes that we faced at that time, in the way that art was taught and the way that our particular affiliations with the Indian miniature in particular, which was the genre that we chose as our personal language, and we wanted to develop that as our personal
So that's
language.
what you were working
At the time in university, yes.
Yeah, but you really struggled with your tutors.
The fact that we were inspired by the Indian miniature tradition really went down like a lead balloon with the tutors, because we were being presented with a Western role models. So there were people like, there were Henri Matisse and Picasso and Gauguin. And they were being heralded as the forefathers of contemporary Western art and who we should be
Male
aspiring to.
tortured geniuses. This
Exactly.
is what a British artist
And
The great innovators.
it wasn't really acknowledged where their inspiration came from, and we could see straight away how they had been inspired by, Persia or Tahiti or, folk art. So, Matisse, for example, it's quite clear that, when you look at some of his compositions, the flattening of perspective and the way that the pattern is
Division of space.
is placed on the composition to help aid that flattening of perspective, division of space, as Amrit said. And we could see immediately the links between that and the aesthetics of Indian miniature painting, for example. And likewise, with Picasso, similar comparisons. But it wasn't something that was acknowledged by our tutors. So it was really at that point that we started thinking about using our art to challenge that
As an act
Eurocentric
of
outlook.
rebellion.
Yes, really, that's how it started. So we have works, for example, this series of work here is our very first set of works that, I say we, but they're actually works that I painted, so used to it being a collaborative thing, which really shows that development from our first year at university in the art department, trying to show a compromise, so it's much more realistic in terms of the colour, this particular composition, the first one. And the only hint really of our Indian identity in that tradition is this bird's eye view peculiarly placed within the centre of the composition.
The carpet.
Yeah, a typical convention of Indian
Yeah.
miniatures, as you know, is this tilted bird's eye view of certain objects.
And we felt we were actually compromising quite a lot because initially when we started at the college we were more or less copying traditional formats of Indian miniature painting, trying to really hone our skills really in that particular tradition. But it wasn't something that was accepted still by our tutors, and they kept telling us to develop. This was the great phrase that they kept using, that we need to develop. And there came a point where, because I guess we felt there was quite a lot of hypocrisy because the Western, fathers of modern art had been inspired by non-European art. So we felt, why was it not okay for us to also be inspired by
And the
non-European?
idea that, contemporary art, you're free to do whatever you want, but you can't do that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So we started developing the work. Our rebellion was that we started accentuating everything that was indicative of the Indian miniature. So the bright contrasting colours, the flattening of the perspective by the way in which we use the decorative aspects of the work as well. So that's the middle piece. And then the final one was taking a step further by accentuating or bringing to life literally all the little ornaments that were in the room that represented our Indian identity, the little Indian ornaments of the elephants and the kind of miniature marble Taj Mahal in the background. They all become the important things in the composition, dominate the composition. So it was just our way of
marching in,
rebelling.
it can't be.
That's right, marching off the window into the living room. But it's still a Western setting.
Yeah.
But it's the way of showing
And
that.
so this is your sitting room at home.
Yes.
And so many of your early works actually address these issues of your cultural heritage and identity and being proud of that. So can you talk to us a bit more about why you chose to paint your family, your home?
Yeah, well, I think the attitude that we faced in the art department, we felt was just an extension of what we had grown up with, being brought up in a very Western dominated area. I mean, where we lived in Liverpool, there were a handful of Indian families.
Right.
And, no Indian, we went to a Roman Catholic convent school. We were the only Indians, the only non-Catholics.
Really?
So it was, there was a lot of pressure there to conform to Western ways of thinking and socialising and, dressing. And also through the media too, we felt that there was a lot of negative stereotypes about traditional Indian culture, particularly institutions like the extended Indian family, arranged marriage system and all of that. So a lot of these earlier works which we did evolved around this idea of promoting the positive aspects of what it was like to live within an extended family, or the positive aspects of, the traditional Indian wedding.
Can we look at the one in the middle?
Yeah, so this one is actually based on our elder sister's wedding, and it's called Nirmala's Wedding too. So it's a very optimistic image, so it's very celebratory with the colours, the reds and the bright yellows, to really show that joy of tradition and how we celebrate that, how we value that. But at the same time, it's looking at taking the best of both worlds. So you have the children playing down here with modern gadgets. You've got your Batman car and your Power Rangers and the radio, which represent the Western, the positive aspects of Western society, if you like, symbolically.
For me, this is very beautiful, a very contemplative image. But there's a shocking aspect to me, which you can't see at the moment, but if you,
was
in the top right-hand corner,
Yes.
you have this manic Ronald McDonald, and it really disturbs me. So why is he there?
Well, I think this is looking not at our own sort of experience as Asians in Britain and the duality of our own identity, but also looking beyond that personal experience to what was happening at that time. We're talking about the 80s and 90s and the whole globalization issue. And McDonald's at that time was this symbol of the sort of the stamp of westernization that was going out there. They weren't just selling products, but also a lifestyle and an image that people were buying into. And so this is juxtaposed against the sort of traditional lifestyle and the happy interior with the destructive nature of globalization and the kind of striving to be so-called westernization without thinking about that or blindly following that path, in the sense that very often for us at that time it was the case that Western lifestyle was often pitched as being forward and progressive and positive, and whereas our own traditions were often being maligned as backward and outdated, as with our miniature tradition. I mean, during the art course, one thing we neglected to mention was that it was told to us in no uncertain terms that we were following a backward and outdated tradition that had no place in contemporary art.
And you were not allowed to celebrate.
No, so, and we wanted to show that there is a value in our own heritage, but also there is a value in picking the best from both worlds, and that
well, why do you need to make the choice, really, wasn't it? The case of why should we, a lot of times people would say, well, are you Indian or are you British? And we're both, and we don't really analyse it. We're born and brought up here. We're as British as we are without Indian identity as well. So why do we have to make that choice? Why can we not celebrate being both?
So I want to ask you about the style that you're working. You've termed it past modern. Can you explain what that term means?
That really goes back to the experience at university again, and the way in which our tutors failed to accept Indian miniatures being valid. But also it was a wider dialogue within the art course at that time, where it seemed that anything traditional, I mean, there were examples of pre-Raphaelite paintings in art, for example, which we just love and, you know, had also inspired our work, that were held up to us as being useless because they didn't lead anywhere. And so it seemed to us that what was being taught, that modern art was all about this mythical thing that somehow existed in a vacuum and was not really acknowledging the past as having played any part in where it was at that time, today. And so we felt that our work was really about trying to challenge that and showing the value of tradition within modernity, but also the value of non-European ways of looking at things, whether it's culture or arts, because going back to that same statement that we made earlier, that very often it's this idea of westernization being equated with modernity, and, you know, Indian heritage or traditional heritage being equated with things that are of the past. So it's a term that really brings the two together and acknowledges the value of tradition, whether it's arts or culture or in any other way within the present-day society.
And your work shares many elements of postmodernism in terms of, you know, appropriation, hybridity, but it does go beyond that. But, you know, they are highly discursive paintings, and you address politics, culture, mass media. And so I wanted to ask you about some of your most famous paintings, which have actually had, you know, quite a media backlash sometimes, starting with 1984. Which depicts Operation Blue Star. Some people in the audience might not know what that was. Do you want to explain the background to this?
Yeah, well, Operation Blue Star it's a political event in India in 1984, which was represented by the Indian government's attack on the Harmandir, or the Golden Temple, which is the central shrine of the Sikhs in northern India, in the city of Amritsar. And this happened when we were still at school, but it was quite a hostile environment for us, because it was pitched by India, in particular by the propaganda of India, as being this attack against so-called militants who had
embedded themselves,
and taken over the Golden Temple complex. And that was only news that was coming out of India at that time because of the propaganda and the media blackout that happened. And so we were going into school with all that sort of banding around, and people saying to us, well, you know, what about your community? Why are they terrorists and militants? And it was really difficult for us to try and put a different perspective forward, because there wasn't anything in the media that we could hold up to our fellow students. And so at that time, we decided that we wanted to create an artwork which put the other side of the story, or at least told more balanced view of what was happening in India. This is actually the second version of that original work, which was a much smaller piece. And this was painted in 1999, quite a few years afterwards, because by that time we had learnt a lot more about what had happened. There were a lot more reports coming out of India from people like Amnesty International, for example, where the truth of the matter was being revealed, that this attack was not just about so-called militants, as they'd been labelled, but also it was something that caused the suffering of a great deal of pilgrims at that time, who had gone to pray as they do daily. Several thousand, I think, died or injured in the attack.
For 3 days, don't forget it was.
Yeah.
But you've got Mrs. Gandhi, the Indian Prime Minister at the time, sitting on a tank at the bottom. 4 months later, she was shot dead by her 2 Sikh bodyguards. You know, if this painting was painted by an Indian artist and exhibited in New Delhi, this would be, this could be seen as a very anti-India statement, and a very pro-Sikh independent nation.
But that was not our intention at all. One thing it's not is anti-Indian. I don't think you can blame a country for the acts of, the leader or the government per se. And definitely, well, I mean, sometimes people ask us, well, where is Bindrawali, who is the so-called militant who was, leading, the cause of the attack in the first place. And we deliberately left him out of this painting because to us, this work was not about, if you like, the politics behind why the government walked in. Our main focus was this was a human tragedy. It was a travesty against human rights. And that was a story that had not got out in the media. I mean, you do have Indira Gandhi there, yes, on the tank, because like a lot of our work, I mean, she's there with other world leaders too throughout history, because one thing we try to do with our work is, although it's coming from a very personal perspective in terms of we come from the Sikh community ourselves, we wanted to get across the idea that this is not something, these kinds of tragedies and these kinds of atrocities are not something unique to our community or any one community. There are the kinds of things that are going on and have gone on, throughout ages, if you like, happening to many different communities at different times and places throughout the world. And we always try to give our works that universal context, no matter how personal a starting point it might come from. This is quite personal in the sense that with the composition itself, you have this bird's eye view, this almost distant view, juxtaposed on the one with this close-up view of the pilgrims scrambling, trying to get out at the bottom half of the. It's a very claustrophobic view at the bottom part of the painting, and that was really looking at the two ways in which we were, on the one hand, very distant from what was going on in India, because geographically there was not an awful lot we could do but sit back and see what was happening in India, but at the same time reflecting our closeness emotionally with the claustrophobic kind of composition at the bottom part of the painting.
I think people will have noticed David Beckham. I've been zooming in.
Oh, right, yeah.
So shall we move on to him?
Well, yeah.
So this was a commission. It was a commission, wasn't it?
It was part of our. We were in 2002 artists in residence for the Commonwealth Games in Manchester. Yeah. So it was a series of work we did as a response to that role, which was looking at the whole relationship between the worlds of sports, media, and celebrity. And this particular image literally represents that whole theme, really. Literally have, the sports hero, Beckham.
The apotheosis of the Beckhams.
Yeah. So it was literally sports and celebrity coming together. And it was showing them as the new royal family, as they'd been dubbed by the tabloid press at the time. Unfortunately, it was an image which became famous in a way which would rather it had not have become famous for the wrong reasons, because it was actually... came within the tabloid press unbeknownst to us. It was not an image that we had given out to the press at all.
Right.
But unfortunately, the Commonwealth Games Department let the image go without a proper press release with it. And before we knew it, there were headlines where it's official, Beckham is God, and Beckham and, posh, depicted as the Hindu deities Shiva and Parvati, and with their elephant-headed god Ganesh.
Because it was based on a conventional.
Because it was based on a conventional image of the god and goddess enthroned with the devotees below. And of course, it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, there aren't any symbols in there relating to the gods and goddesses of Hinduism, but it was just the way in which in a way, it proved our point, because one of the messages through the work was showing the fickleness of the media and how they can twist things. So you have their throne propped up by these very precariously placed magazines and newspapers that could topple them at any minute. On the one hand,
That's what I noticed. There is this sense of vulnerability. They're almost slipping off the throne, so you know that.
That's right. So you can, the press can kind of make you or break you in the same way we've had lots of accolades through the press, but suddenly we were getting criticised, for unjust reasons. And then you have these two figures at the top here, these angels who again represent the press, one of whom is showering the couple with eggs and the other one with stars. So again, it's looking at that fickleness of the press, how they can make and break, celebrity status.
And this was a £16,000 question put by Chris Tarrant on Who Wants to Be a
It was.
Millionaire. Am I right in thinking that?
It was that came at an unfortunate time too, because we did have a lot of backlash with this image. We had death threats and sheep's heads put on our doorstep and graffiti written on our home, through a handful of people, I have to say, who I would call them fundamentalists, who didn't like the fact that...
Well, they didn't want to know the truth.
Well, they didn't take the time
to explain to people, but you'd still find them regurgitating tabloid nonsense.
So we had about a year of harassment with this image, and then just as everything died down and we felt that it was safe to put our head above the parapet again, this question came on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire.
What was the question?
The question was, who had recently been depicted in the lead-up to the Commonwealth Games as a Hindu god?
Which is
And we were like, oh my goodness, here we go again. Fasten our seatbelts.
Well, let's bring the discussion back to the Indian painting tradition. Because I think a lot of people just think of Indian painting as colour, as pattern, as symbolism, and they don't quite realise that there are specific visual languages that the artists followed, and conventions that were followed, and you definitely address those in some of your works.
We do, yes. I mean, just to show three examples, the far left hand, I'm going to try and zoom in a little
That's
bit
another
if I
one
can.
from
So this is another from the Spotlight series, which again is looking at the relationship between companies that have the sponsorship for sports, riding on the back of the media, and together they're slaying the ideal Olympian vision of sport, if you like, which is represented by the boar. So you can see, or I hope you can see, if I try and go in as close as I can, that each of the elements, or the figure, the horse and the boar, are made up of figures within themselves, which is this convention that was used very often with Indian miniature paintings, which I think was a lot to do with showing off the technique and the skill of the miniaturists, how they could make figures from numerous other figures. It just, I think, I can't take credit,
animals
actually.
with camels and elephants made of figures and other animals, composite style.
So this is one convention that we thought we would use with this particular image, and actually I can't take credit for it. I think Amrit angst over this particular work. I think you almost gave up at one point, didn't you? Trying to make everything fit.
But I think we've taken that tradition slightly further in that it's not just about showing clever technique and challenging yourself as an artist, but also creating a narrative of the imagery that we've used as well. So the choice of objects that make up the figure, the horse, the boar, they all have a particular meaning that go towards extending on the narrative that we were trying to tell for that particular artwork.
And for your series, The Art of Loving, which looks at the Ragamala tradition, which, if people don't know, are paintings that are based on musical modes, so specific types of music that are inspired by different times of day, different seasons, to create a specific mood that is reflected in a painting. But it's always this very idealized visions of the idealized female beauty representing this specific mood. And so your series based on that.
That's right. So that's the third one here with the.
But it was also a tradition. It's also a tradition that related the musical melodies with the seasons as well, and also human emotions particularly over the scenario of the lovers and the various states of being, if you like, of the two lovers, or the relationship between them. And this particular image is based on the one which is all about the sort of excitement of young love and the young girl getting herself ready for her beloved. Now, in our version, it's sort of the multicultural, modern context of that, where you have the British Asian girl getting ready for a night out on the town. And, just as with the traditional Indian miniature way of depicting this, where it's usually a woman adorning herself with jewellery, or her maids fanning
Doing
her,
her
or whatever,
hair,
doing something to make herself look acceptable for
her lover. Yeah.
So you have this context where it's the multicultural Britain, the girl going out on the town, but also making a commentary about cultural ownership as well, and cultural appropriation, because behind her, I mean, she has henna on her own hands, which is obviously part of our Indian tradition of body adornment, but you then have this picture of Madonna behind her. And again, this was painted at a time where Madonna was, well, I guess she still is a trendsetter, but she was really in the headlines for being a trendsetter at that time. And I guess she put henna on the map in terms of
In the West, at least,
Western practice. But she put it on the map in such a way that it became sort of repackaged as body art, and it totally lost its significance and its ritual, cultural value outside of the Indian context. So this is what this image was also talking about.
But you go way beyond the traditional miniature painting, obviously, and the Indian painting tradition. And you started back in the 80s. In the 90s, there was a movement in Pakistan where there was a sudden revival in the Indian miniature painting tradition as well, the so-called neo-miniaturist movement. And lots of Pakistani artists have achieved international recognition now. How do you situate your work in relation to what's now coming out of Pakistan?
Well, I think we obviously, we admire the work very much that they're doing. They're brilliant artists. We're familiar with a lot of their work and the skill, and I think they've done a lot to put Indian miniature painting on the map within contemporary art. But I think we feel that we've kind of been precursors to that in many ways, but also pioneers in developing our work in a way that's coming from a totally different context to the Lahore school, in that our work is coming from a very political viewpoint in terms of our own personal experience and the prejudice that we've experienced. And I think there's also some suggestion that artists of that school have also been inspired by our work. So, for example, this image on screen at the moment is one of our paintings on the left, called Dil, which is one of our very, very early works that shows an interior, stylized version of one of the interiors within our own home. And Shazia Sikandar, who's one of the well-known artists of Lahore, has used the banister structure as part of the compositional elements within two of her works on the right. So I think we place ourselves as very much part of that tradition of reinvention, modernization, but not necessarily linked to what's happening in Lahore. I think it's an entirely different...
But also I think people misperceive our work in the sense that they feel that we are all about Indian miniatures and that's our only inspiration. But we feel that our work's much more eclectic than that, and that from a very early age we've always been inspired and influenced by many other different art forms, Western art forms
series,
too. So we have things like, this particular work which has been very much inspired by medieval manuscript painting, for example, and then moving on, British satire, so Gilray prints. This is a very recent work which is reinterpreting a certifical image by James Gilray. William Blake, who's been another big influence on our work, in which we try and reinterpret a lot of the, biblical narratives, but for a modern day setting. So this particular one is looking at the beast of Revelation, but how it's not about this mythical beast just rising from the sea, but it's about how evil is manifest in the world today through pollution and political corruption and that kind of thing. And then we have works like Entwined, which are
people may
inspired
recognise
by
this.
Victorian
The
artist
curators
O'Neill.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
Artist in Empire chose this as one of the final works on display in the show.
Yes, well, this work was actually commissioned by the Museum of London, and it was specifically, the brief was to actually respond to two paintings that they had by O'Neill, one of which is shown on the right here, and you can see the direct
high
relationship.
Victorian propaganda painting.
Yeah, exactly. So it was about, the images were showing the heroes of the what was then called, the Indian Mutiny, the homecoming of the British troops after, quashing the Indian Rebellion. And it was how we responded to that as British Asians, really. And so initially the focus was on that particular image and reinterpreting that in the light of who were our heroes. It was, the freedom fighters of India who were disembarking from the boat. It was, what was the legacy of that? The fact that we ourselves are born and brought up in England. So, there's our grandmother and our father there, and various other figures. And very much like the triptych, the Royal Britannia image is looking at the legacies of the positive impact of the rebellion, if you like, or the...
I was going to ask, can we move on to your Slaves of Fashion series, which is your most recent work? For that, it's such an ambitious project. You've got the light boxes that we mentioned earlier, a 20-minute film, an animation with a poem. You've got a whole archive collection as well. You've got some painted work. Can you tell us a bit about where did this all start? What was the idea behind this?
The series actually came about 4 years ago when we had the opportunity to travel to Nantes. It was part of a British Council trip. There were some educationalists, environmentalists, and we as artists had been asked along as well. And we weren't quite sure what the purpose of the trip was, if I'm quite honest with you, but we thought we had this opportunity, and we did a bit of research before we went, and we discovered that they had a slavery museum in Nantes. So we'd always been interested in the history of slavery, and we thought, well, let's see what there is and what comes from this particular encounter. And as we were walking around the museum, the curator was giving us a tour of the various objects on display, and she stopped at a case that had some Indian textiles there. At the time, we didn't realise they were Indian, I have to confess, because they had all these patterns of rhinos and tigers and little African huts and trees, all in shades of sort of beiges and browns. They didn't look Indian to us at all. And she explained that they actually had been produced in India by order of the French, and in fact that they had been used for exchange for slaves in Africa. And this took us aback, really, because it's the first time that we certainly had realised that India was part of this, what we know as the Transatlantic slave triangle. We often think of this as something that's to do with the Western Hemisphere, and yet here was this sort of panhandle going out to India, and it really got us thinking about India's wider connection with the slave trade. And so when we returned home, we did quite a bit of research into that aspect, and it opened up a whole new area of interest, which was basically India's trade in textiles historically, and how that was really a story of global politics and conflict, empire.
So is the series also a timeline?
It is in a sense, yes, because I mean the first 11 of the whole series of 20-odd works were looking at the historical aspects of that whole story. So looking at, starting from the kind of ancient roots of India and how the trade with India, with the Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks, then going through to the kind of Spanish and Portuguese connections, through to the Dutch connections, the trade with India, then looking at certain themes as well. So we have this image all in blue here, which was looking at the trade in indigo particularly. Then we had chintz as another...
The Braganza?
Yeah, Catherine Braganza there. So there were these 11 images that took different themes, different places that textiles were produced, or the textiles
also
themselves.
celebrating historic women. I was slightly disappointed, perhaps, that you included a man. Why is it?
Well,
you've got 10 amazing women and this, calico.
Well, this aspect is calico. So
There's a modern one, yeah.
He was Calico Jack the pirate, and Calico, we used him to represent the piracy aspect, the plunder aspect of that whole trade with India, especially through the East India Company. So he just fitted the bill, unfortunately.
So you couldn't find a woman who fitted the bill?
I guess he would have had a woman pirate, but he was named Calico Jack, so he had to represent Calico, really.
We'll forgive.
But there's also part of the series our contemporary responses to the historical perspectives.
In case anyone missed all those contemporary resonances in the earlier works.
Yeah, well, the contemporary resonances are there, but we did want to make that clearer and make those connections between the sort of colonial attitudes and trade and the link between trade and conflict of the past and how that really continues today. And then also creating works that link into dialogues of concern, to do with ethical consumerism and trade practices.
I love that. Can you explain, why Donald Trump is
Well, he's representing...
on a catwalk?
Well, he's on a catwalk because he's representing the status of cotton today as one of the most widely sought-after commodities within the fashion world, just as it was in the days of the East India Company and right the way through the Industrial Revolution. It was such a highly prized commodity, and I think we forget that it still is, and it still comes with the same problems in a way. Today, it's still linked to sort of modern-day slavery. You talk about the sweatshops and indentured labourers, and even the forced labour of picking cotton, particularly in places like Uzbekistan, for example, and then also the link between cotton and what's been linked to the suicide farmers in India, particularly Punjab. because of the cycle of debt that these farmers get into. The image is talking about a particular type of cotton which is genetically modified, and these farmers are sold the seeds of this genetically modified version, and they become dependent on them because they can't replant them. They're sterile. You use them once and that's it. And so they then can't afford to reinvest in this new technology and all the fertilizers and everything else that are tied to it. And unfortunately, it's really produced very unfortunate conditions for farmers in India, and a lot of them are committing suicide because they can't basically afford to maintain their fields and support their families.
Running out of time, so
okay.
I just want to see what's next. What's next for Slavers Fashion? What's next for you?
Well, we're still looking for venues to tour the exhibition. It launched at the National Museums Liverpool earlier this year, and it's toured to Wolverhampton. But it's taken 4 years to create this body of work, and we really are keen to get wider exposure for it. There are so many different issues.
Could you take it overseas?
Definitely, India, America, Europe. I mean, as I said, it's a global story. It's not just about Indian textiles. It's about the whole politics of the world, and there are so many, every continent that you can think of, and every aspect of history that you can think of is represented through this series. So that's the first thing, to get this thing toured, particularly London as a key venue, for example.
And of course, Royal Britannia will actually become a part of this tour
exciting
as well, because it does link into a lot of the themes, which is why the timing was so great actually for doing the commission here, because it was a continuation of what we were already working on in many ways.
I never asked you how you came to, from painting to this new digital mixed media light box.
Okay. Well, we've always been interested in digital technologies, and we've been using them quite a lot in the past for the compositional elements of our work. So very often when we're trying to design something on paper, in the old days it was, draw something, rub it out, rework, and very messy, very time consuming. So we worked out a way of doing that using software like Photoshop, where you could input imagery from the internet, from books, from wherever, sort of on-site photographs, play around with those, enlarge them, reduce them, skew them, reposition them. And then for this series, we wanted a way really of creating works that were very large scale, because we knew there was going to be a lot of narrative in the works. And of course, that would be lost if they were produced on the small scale that we're essentially known for. And digital just provided the platform and the means of doing that. I think in terms of the light boxes, what we wanted to replicate was the fact that these final artworks are digital works. They don't exist anywhere else except the computer in their final form. And what we see, the best or the most true way of seeing that work is on a computer screen. So if we want to output that and display it in a gallery, how do we then replicate that true form of the final artwork? And so the idea of creating these large-scale light boxes was born, if you like. And I guess with the textile theme, the works became printed on textiles for the Slaves of Fashion.
It just seems so obvious.
That was continued for the work that we did for you.
Well, shall we open the floor?
Yes, let's. So, firstly, I just like to say thank you so much. It's not the end, but I just wanted to say thank you for that wonderful conversation. And I'm sure there are many more themes. We've scratched the surface of quite a number of different topics, but there's lots more there, I'm sure. We've got two roving mics, so do stop your questions, start to raise your hands, and please wait for a microphone to get to you before you start speaking.
It's about your Theresa May depiction. If we can see it again in close-up. And
I don't know if I can get it quite close-up. I'll try my best.
Can you tell us what was your thinking behind doing that one?
Well, this particular work, this one and the Gilray inspired works, they're actually, the starting point was the newspaper headlines around the outside of the images. So it was the idea of looking at the historical themes. In this case, it was looking at new ideas about empire. So one of the, some of the rhetoric around post-Brexit talks, if you like, about how Britain wants to reconnect with their former colonies and trade with their former colonies, India being one of the countries at the top of that list. And that's something that's been dubbed in Whitehall as Empire too. So it was looking at that idea initially, and also looking at some of the concerns that, I guess, anti-Brexit, what's the word? the people that are against Brexit have
Which
put it on word. So you've got things, you've got Theresa May. It's actually based on a very old print of the Colossus of Rhodes, but this is called Colossus of Woes. And so she has one foot in India, she has one foot in the States, and beneath herself is very this floundering ship of the EU. So obviously it's about Britain bypassing the EU, and a lot of the newspaper reports that are coming out, the impression that we gain from this is that basically there seems to be this race to get this trade deal with particularly India in the light of obviously the country exiting the European Union. So it was very much about that really, looking at the new kind of neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism post-Brexit.
Pleasure to hear all about you. One thing I don't think we did hear much about was your collaborative work. I've, as you know, been lucky to know your work for a long, long time. And I think the way you collaborate is really interesting, and I think this audience would like to hear.
Thank you. Okay, well, how do we start with that? I guess it comes out of our shared experiences and the prejudice that we faced going through the art system and trying to develop this style. I think that's made us very close as artists. And also but also during that experience, one thing we didn't mention was the fact that we were twins, obviously, and how that was viewed by our art tutors, which was really frowned upon because we were being taught, you were going back to this idea of modern art, and it seemed to be all about the individual. And God forbid if you have two artists who look the same and have a similar artistic skill and are interested in the same things, we were constantly being told, well, why don't you study that and why don't you study that? And, you know, it wasn't enough to say, well, actually, I'm just not interested in it. I'm actually interested in the same things independently.
But it's very part of the Indian tradition. Indian artists traditionally work in family workshops. It's a hereditary craft that is handed down. Were you, was that something you were aware of when you were starting out?
I don't think it was that, no. It was just...
It became a conscious thing because of the reaction we got in art college to the fact that we were working in a very, very similar style, because they felt that we weren't being individual enough in terms of, you know, that was the be-all and end-all of being a contemporary artist. So it was at that point we actually joined forces, if you like, and rebelled against that notion of individuality. We started dressing the same. We didn't deliberately go out and be inspired by the same things, but we just naturally go everywhere together and just tend to be fired up by the same things, or, you know...
When did the name Singh Twins start? Because before were you... Am I right in thinking you were Twin Studio at one point?
We were, yeah. Well, that was a kind of official registered business name, but obviously it doesn't really work well in terms of an artist name, I don't think. It's more of a kind of a business feel to it. So I don't know, the Singh Twins...
I guess in the 90s, after we graduated and we started to think of art as a career option, and then obviously we wanted to develop that idea that we do collaborate together and that we do present ourselves as one artist. And that's really from stage one right the way through. So with the Slaves of Fashion, for example, the first stage with a lot of our work is actually doing the research, because there's so much that needs to be uncovered before we can even start to think about what the themes are. And we'll usually do that independently, so we'll know what the general theme is and we'll go off and we'll research for a week or a few days or a month or however long that takes. And we'll come together and pool our resources and then fine-tune the findings and decide what we're going to represent within the works in mind. And having done that, if it's with a series of works, then we'll divide the series equally. If it's a single work, particularly with commissioned works, then we will both jointly work on those pieces. But even with a series, it's always an ongoing dialogue between the two of us. So, you know, with the Slaves of Fashion, I think I had 6 and she had 5. It just worked out that way. But
no, because we had 5 each, and then you decided to add silks and quilts last minute.
And do you ever fight about when a work is finished?
Well, yes and no, in that she accuses me of gilding the lily, so I guess that means she doesn't always like me adding another final mark.
You accuse me of being over-perfectionist, which I am. But with my over-perfectionism and your gilding the lily, I think together we kind of get a...
Maybe we crack it, I don't know.
Get it right.
But yeah, it's a close process.
Thanks very much. Fascinating talk. I went to see your Slaves of Fashion exhibition in Wolverhampton, and it was absolutely outstanding. I don't know whether it's off yet, but if anyone hasn't seen it, they should...
Finished, unfortunately, about a week ago.
I was going to say zoom up now, but too late. Okay. Mine is a technical question to do with the digital light boxes. How do you get the images? Do you draw first, photograph, scan? What's the technique you use for producing those images?
There's a combination of elements with these works. One is the hand-drawn and hand-painted details. So once they're finalised, I say finalised, I'll kind of qualify that in a minute, because sometimes it's the complete image that is then scanned into a computer and then cut out of the computer page, and then we do whatever we need to then put it into the final composition. But with some of those hand-painted elements in Slaves of Fashion, they were also reworked in the computer. So, for example, is the indigo one there? Yeah. We should have brought some working process things. But anyway, so for example, with the indigo image, which shows Mumtaz Mahal, her figure was entirely painted except for all the jewels and the jewellery that you see, and the transparent skirt. So that was all applied afterwards digitally using various software techniques. And then there were other elements within the work that were scanned from archival material. So we have a collection ourselves of various printed memorabilia and archival prints and journals and engravings, which were again scanned into the computer, either used wholesale as the object themselves or somehow reworked if it was relative to the narrative that we were trying to tell. And then there are other elements within these works. So if we look at the, I'll try and find one. I don't think we have, well, okay, let's go to, no, it's not going to work on that, sorry. But one of the artworks has a piece of jewellery, for example. Well, it's similar to this, which actually only started life as a black and white drawing, and then so everything else that you see there was put together in the computer. And it's a case of creating each of those beads individually, for example, and the software that we use is a system of layers, almost like transparent pages that you have in the traditional way of creating animation. And each transparent layer has a detail on it, and you build up the shapes and the colours and things like, you can apply techniques like outlining, embossing, drop shadows to give a more three-dimensional effect. So a lot of the information was, the detail was produced that way as well. And the reason why we did that, particularly for things like jewellery, which is obviously a much finer decorative element of the artworks, is because if we had painted them by hand, and the original figures are about probably, the painted figures are probably about this big. You've seen at the exhibition that the final works are about 2.5, 3 metres.
Yeah, they're life size.
Life size.
Yeah.
So if we had painted all those details by hand, we were mindful of the fact that when we come to enlarge those works, it would really look very messy. And we wanted to use the technology in a way that would enable us to retain the definition of the objects and the kind of the beauty of the objects as well when they were enlarged. I think, does that answer the whole? Yeah, and then they were printed out. They were finally, all these elements were put together in the composition. It took quite a long time to actually reach the final composition. And each one of these artworks, maybe 10 or 12 series of computerized versions of the final version that you see there before we were kind of happy with it. And then they were digitally printed onto fabric and stretched onto the light boxes.
It was. We did think that at one time when we started using the computer more and more for helping to compose and create, we thought it would actually save time, but actually when you've got 250 layers for one image, it actually was taking the same amount of time it would take to paint almost. But at this particular scale, I mean, these are life-size portraits. There's 11 of them, so it would have taken 11 years to do literally all by hand. And so again, the technology came into play there to help us to get that show together in 4 years rather than 11 years.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we've run out of time. We could continue speaking, I think, and I think very kindly the Singh Twins are going to be around for a little while, so we might be able to continue the conversation over a refreshing drink. But I just want to say thank you again, and thank you for all of your questions. So, another round of applause. Thank you.